I knew something was wrong the day I returned from summer camp and found my bedroom stripped bare. My posters, my art supplies, even the quilt Grandma made me, all shoved into boxes. My father stood in the doorway, coolly explaining that my brother needed extra space for his new hobbies. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear. I was 14, still smelling like campfire smoke and freedom, yet an icy realization sank in. In this house, I was expendable. My parents always boasted about being fair, but in that moment I saw the truth. My brother was the sun and I was just another shadow. I don't think my parents ever meant to be cruel. Growing up, there were small signs that my brother, Eddie, commanded their attention in ways I didn't, but it took me years to register how deeply those patterns ran. Maybe it started when we were toddlers and he learned to talk unusually early. My mom would point at him in wonder, calling him her little prodigy, while my father recorded every adorable syllable on the camcorder. I wasn't jealous then, I was just a baby. But as we grew older, little moments added up. I remember being 6 and showing my dad a lopsided clay pot I made at school. He patted my head, said it was cute, and returned to praising Eddie for winning a simple spelling bee. Or how every Christmas, Eddie's gifts felt more expensive, more carefully chosen, though maybe that was just my imagination. Our parents were never overtly hostile. They just seemed to gravitate toward Eddie's accomplishments with beaming pride, while mine were acknowledged with faint smiles. By the time we hit our teenage years, Eddie's interests became more sophisticated: piano lessons, advanced math clubs, big science fairs, and he excelled at them with ease. Our parents practically orbited around him, paying for private tutors, special summer programs, anything to keep his spark alive. Meanwhile, I hopped between typical teenage hobbies: painting, some sports, writing short stories. I never reached remarkable heights, but I liked exploring different interests. Whenever I tried telling my parents about a new passion, they'd politely nod, then pivot to discussing Eddie's next big opportunity. That particular summer, the one where I returned from camp and found my bedroom commandeered, stung more than anything. Eddie decided he needed a music studio, so my father proposed turning my room into an extension of his. I recall standing there, mouth agape, while my mom tried to soothe me with a hollow promise: "We'll figure out another space for you, sweetheart." Another space turned out to be a cramped corner of the basement. It was dark, damp, and smelt faintly of mildew, but they cheerily placed a futon there, patted me on the shoulder, and declared it a fun hangout spot. I spent 2 weeks in that basement corner, feeling more exiled than ever. At night, I cried softly, furious and confused. Eddie rarely ventured down to see me. If he did, it was to ask me to keep quiet while he recorded a new song upstairs. I started to fantasize about running away, but I lacked a plan. I was only 14. Where could I go? Besides, I still clung to the hope that my parents would wake up and realize how unfair their actions were. Maybe they'd see how it crushed me to feel perpetually second place in my own family. Time marched on. Eddie soared through high school, racking up awards. My parents bragged about him to neighbors, relatives, and anyone who'd listen. Meanwhile, I muddled through with average grades, haunted by the sense that I was overshadowed by a brilliant star. At 16, I secretly got a part-time job at a local cafe, desperate for money to carve out a sense of independence. My parents never bothered to ask where I was heading every afternoon. They were too busy shuttling Eddie to recitals or advanced courses. When I turned 17, I found a glimmer of hope. An art teacher at school noticed my sketches. She praised my sense of color, encouraging me to enter a statewide art competition. A surge of excitement flooded me. I finally had something I was good at, something that might garner recognition. 4 weeks, I poured myself into painting a large abstract piece that expressed the swirl of emotions I'd bottled up: frustration, longing, and the quiet rage of being unseen. I spent late nights in the school's art room, meticulously layering paint to form something that felt raw and personal. The day I entered the competition, I practically floated with pride. My teacher was convinced I stood a strong chance. I rushed home, eager to share my excitement. My mother was in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge, and I blurted out about the contest. She half smiled, said, "That's nice, honey," then abruptly announced that Eddie had been invited to perform at a prestigious event. She asked if I could help iron his suit. My elation deflated. Her words landed like a slap. "Yes, your little painting is cute. Now, back to your brother's real achievements." That was the day something inside me cracked. I pictured the basement corner I called a bedroom, the minimal attention my parents gave my aspirations, and the endless fawning over Eddie. I wasn't just overshadowed, I was invisible. For the first time, I felt a primal urge to escape. I didn't know how or when, but I vowed I would break free from this stifling environment. The same environment that taught me my worth was negligible. High school graduation arrived. Eddie, a year older, was already off to a prestigious college on a scholarship, an achievement our parents celebrated with a massive party. By contrast, I scrounged for smaller scholarships for an art program in a less famous but respectable state university. The day of my own graduation, I recall scanning the crowd for my parents. I spotted them in the bleachers, clapping politely, not half as animated as they'd been for Eddie's ceremonies. Still, a flicker of hope told me maybe, just maybe, they'd see me in a new light once I left for college. The summer after graduation was suffocating. I worked 3 part-time jobs. My parents offered no help, claiming finances were tight after Eddie's expenses. Meanwhile, I saved every penny, determined to have enough for tuition and living costs. My father occasionally scoffed at my dedication to art, saying, "You're better off doing something practical." My mother rarely addressed me directly, except to mention the latest news from Eddie, how he was thriving at college. He'd call home occasionally, overshadowing every dinner conversation with talk of his bright prospects. I found myself shrinking further, counting the days until I could move out. Finally, in late August, I packed my meager belongings into my battered old car, bidding a silent farewell to the dingy basement corner. My parents offered a half-hearted good luck, not even bothering to help load the car. Driving away, I felt an odd mixture of fear and euphoria. The open road, the promise of a new city, maybe there I could carve out an identity separate from Eddie's overshadowing presence. University life was a revelation. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who saw me for who I was, not who I wasn't. My dorm mates appreciated my artistic flair, my professors nurtured my potential, and I discovered that I possessed a quiet determination that could spark real success. Each day, I studied painting techniques, delved into art history, and honed my craft in studio classes. The supportive environment was a stark contrast to the stifling favoritism I'd grown up with, but it wasn't just academic growth. Freed from the constant overshadowing of my brother, I began to blossom socially. I found friends who embraced my quirks, and some who even admired my resilience. I learned to voice my thoughts, to take pride in my creative vision. I also took on campus jobs to pay my bills, working in the library or assisting with campus events. Money was tight, my parents offered no support, but I navigated scholarships, part-time gigs, and the occasional ramen dinner with gritty resolve. During my second year, I won a regional art competition, placing first with a series of emotional portraits. The recognition felt like a balm on old wounds. I sent a brief text to my parents about it, hoping they'd share a shred of enthusiasm. Their reply was a generic "that's nice." Meanwhile, they bragged on social media about Eddie's latest internship. I realized then that I might never gain their approval. Oddly enough, the realization freed me. I stopped chasing their pride. My worth didn't hinge on their validation. The following summer, I visited home for a week, mostly out of obligation. Eddie was also home, bragging incessantly about his campus activities. My parents' eyes sparkled as they listened to him. I was an afterthought, a footnote in the family storyline. When I tried discussing my progress in art school, they shifted focus back to him. By the end of that miserable week, I decided I wouldn't come back unless it was absolutely necessary, and so the distance between me and my parents grew wider. I poured myself into my art, building a decent portfolio. By junior year, I'd secured a mentorship with a well-known local artist, which led to small exhibitions in local galleries. My parents never once attended a show, nor did they ask about my success. Eddie, on the other hand, soared through college, traveling abroad for a semester, his every move still the topic of family phone calls. It hurt, but I had grown numb to the pain. Upon graduation, I faced a critical decision: remain near my university to build an artistic presence or move elsewhere. By a stroke of luck, I'd been offered a position as an assistant curator at a small but promising art gallery in a city several hours from my hometown. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it aligned perfectly with my passion. Accepting that role felt like stepping into the next stage of independence. I found a cheap studio apartment, leaning on the quiet drive that had propelled me forward all these years. During those early months in the new city, I struggled financially. The curator job paid modestly, so I supplemented my income by selling small commission pieces and freelancing as an illustrator for local businesses. Despite the long hours, I felt more fulfilled than ever. For the first time, my art wasn't just a hobby, it was my livelihood, my identity, a testament to the grit that had carried me through my lonely childhood. One day, about a year into my new life, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering. It turned out to be a major event organizer who'd seen my work in a local cafe. She was hosting a citywide art festival and wanted me to showcase some of my pieces. I nearly dropped the phone in excitement. This was the biggest opportunity I'd ever had. My mind swirled with possibilities. My paintings would be displayed alongside established artists, open to critics and potential buyers from all over. As the festival approached, I worked tirelessly, painting late into the night, channeling every ounce of emotion I had into my art. I crafted a series that explored themes of identity, resilience, and the quiet struggle of feeling unseen. Friends rallied around me, offering feedback and moral support. My parents, predictably, were absent from any conversation about it. I no longer bothered sending them updates. If they couldn't muster interest in my smaller achievements, they certainly wouldn't care about this, yet fate had other plans. Somehow, rumors of my involvement reached my parents. Whether through a distant relative or social media chatter, I'm not entirely sure. About 2 days before the festival's grand opening, my phone buzzed with a call from home. My mother's voice trembled with something akin to regret. She said, "We heard about your big art festival. That's wonderful, sweetie." I bristled at the term of endearment. When was the last time she called me sweetie? My heart hammered in my chest. She asked if they could come see it. A swirl of conflicting emotions rose in me: anger, hope, skepticism, and longing. My gut reaction was to politely say no, but a small part of me, the part that once yearned for their validation, hesitated. "If you'd like," I said, voice guarded. "It's open to the public. The event starts at 4 p.m. this Friday." She exhaled, relief apparent in her tone, and stammered something about them wanting to support me. I ended the call quickly, reeling from the unexpected invitation. The day of the festival dawned bright and crisp. My paintings were arranged in a corner booth, each one reflecting my journey. I pinned up a short artist statement that hinted at a childhood overshadowed by sibling favoritism and the drive to forge my own path. Friends from the gallery helped me set up. My nerves fluttered like a nest of butterflies. Would my parents actually show up? A part of me feared they would overshadow the entire event if they did. Another part dreaded the ache of seeing them remain absent. When the doors opened, a steady stream of visitors wandered through. I engaged them politely, explaining my piece's concepts. Some nodded thoughtfully, others asked questions. 2 hours later, my friend nudged me, gesturing toward the entrance. I glanced up. There they were, my father and mother, looking older than I remembered, scanning the crowd awkwardly. My father held a bouquet of daisies, my mother a small bag. They spotted me and approached, uncertain smiles on their faces. That I mustered a polite greeting, ignoring the swirl in my gut. They offered a few stilted compliments about how impressive everything looked. My father extended the daisies, mumbling, "These are for you." My mother handed me the bag, some homemade cookies apparently. "We wanted to say, we're proud of you," she said haltingly. I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat, forcing a small nod. I wasn't sure what to feel, relief, anger, or an odd pity for their attempt at reconciliation. We stood there in uncomfortable silence. Then a pair of festival-goers paused at my booth, studying a painting depicting a figure overlooked by a looming silhouette. One turned to me, praising the emotional resonance. My father cleared his throat, stepping aside. My mother offered a faint smile, as though realizing how literal these paintings were to my personal story. I took a moment to explain the piece to the visitors, ignoring the prickling awareness of my parents' presence behind me. When the visitors moved on, my mother inhaled, eyes glistening. "These paintings, they're so powerful," she murmured, voice trembling. My father nodded, looking uncharacteristically contrite. We had no idea how deeply you felt," he admitted softly, glancing at the painting that practically screamed about favoritism. Emotions churned in me, old wounds opening. Part of me wanted to lash out, but I held steady, not wanting to create a scene in front of potential buyers and art lovers. They lingered for a bit, flipping through my small brochure. I noticed the guilt etched on their faces, recognized the regret in their eyes. Maybe the rawness of my art forced them to confront the reality they'd ignored for so long. I answered their occasional questions about the process, but kept my tone distant. I was no longer that basement-bound teenager desperate for scraps of validation. Now, I had a life of my own making. Eventually, they left with quiet goodbyes, saying they hoped we could talk more soon. I shrugged non-committally, focusing on the festival. When it ended later that night, to my shock, I discovered I'd sold nearly half my paintings. The moment the last customer departed, I leaned against a wall, tears trickling down my cheeks, tears of triumph, relief, and a strange sorrow for the parents who finally glimpsed how deeply their actions had cut me. Over the next weeks, I received multiple phone calls and texts from them. Some were brief apologies, others longer attempts to explain how they'd never intended to neglect me. They admitted they had idolized Eddie's achievements, failing to recognize mine. My father said, "We regret it every day how we made you feel." My mother tearfully asked if we could visit each other. I read their messages with a heavy heart, uncertain if bridging the gap was possible. They'd shaped my self-worth for so long, and I'd grown beyond their shadow now. One Sunday, my mother called while I was painting. She left a voicemail, voice cracking. "I know we can't fix the past, but we miss you. We realize we pushed you away and we're proud of what you've become. Please give us a chance." Listening to it, I felt a pang of empathy. Could I let them back in? They'd awakened to their mistakes too late, but maybe we could forge a new relationship, on my terms. Though eventually I called back. We spoke for a while, the conversation awkward yet tinged with a new honesty. My mother acknowledged how living with Eddie's brilliance made them inadvertently forget about my needs. My father confessed he'd been rigid in his belief that only academic or high-profile pursuits mattered. They both insisted they wanted to mend things, and that they understood if I didn't trust them right away. I ended the call feeling uncertain but slightly hopeful. Over the next few months, we tried baby steps. They'd occasionally invite me home for dinner, but I refused. Instead, I invited them to my city to experience the life I'd built. They actually came, visited my small studio apartment. My father looked taken aback by the modest space, the art supplies scattered around. My mother teared up seeing a half-finished painting leaning against a wall. She recognized a few abstract shapes reminiscent of old childhood memories, our backyard tree, the basement. I stayed guarded but polite, letting them see glimpses of the world they'd never cared to ask about before. Meanwhile, I heard through the grapevine that Eddie had graduated with honors and snagged a high-paying job in finance. My parents were proud, of course, but apparently he'd grown distant, traveling constantly. They rarely saw him, and rumor had it he was too absorbed in his own success to come home. Ironically, the golden child was now the absent one. My mother confided, "We hardly talk. I guess he's busy." She said it with a wistful tone, as if realizing too late that in idolizing him, they'd created a dynamic where he felt little obligation to them. One day, my mother admitted with trembling words, "I used to wish Eddie would come home more. But I realize how we pushed you out, and you might never come back. That's our deepest regret." I stood in silence, grappling with compassion and resentment. Part of me longed to say, "You made your bed, now lie in it," but I couldn't muster cruelty. Instead, I told her gently that I'd built a life elsewhere, one that nourished me. I had no plans to move back to a place that once stifled me. If they wanted to be part of my life, they'd have to come on my terms. They continued visiting occasionally, sometimes bringing homemade meals, sometimes surprising me with small gifts. At first, I suspected they were trying to buy my forgiveness. Over time, though, I sensed genuine remorse fueling their gestures. They didn't demand I return home or revolve my life around them. They simply offered support, finally letting me claim the spotlight. It felt surreal, after years of neglect, to see them humbly asking for my time and attention. Despite the slow healing, I remain cautious. I have a fulfilling career in the art world, a small but growing circle of patrons who appreciate my work, and friends who've become my chosen family. My parents' acceptance, while meaningful, is no longer the be-all and end-all for me. I know they regret the years of favoritism, regret how they belittled my achievements, regret forcing me into that lonely basement corner. But I can't rewrite the past. I can only shape the present and the future. Sometimes they ask if I'd be open to a big family reunion, maybe a holiday get-together with Eddie too. I hesitate, picturing the old dynamics. I'm not sure if Eddie has changed or if he'd still overshadow every room he steps into. My father says Eddie's lost some of his luster, that life hasn't been as perfect as it seemed. I remain ambivalent. The hurt runs deep, and I'm not ready to re-enter that sibling dynamic. Maybe someday. For now, I focus on building a life grounded in self-worth, creativity, and genuine connections. A few months ago, my father confided that they rarely see Eddie. He apparently invests all his energy in his career, rarely returning calls. "We took your presence for granted all those years," my father said wistfully. "Now we miss both of you, but at least you let us see you from time to time." I offered a small nod. It's not exactly revenge, but there's a poetic justice in how their once favored child remains distant, while the daughter they undervalued is at least willing to talk. They do regret it, every day as they watch me thrive and realize they had a hand in driving me away. On my end, I found a measure of peace. I paint what I want, I live where I want, I associate with who I want. My parents' regret is theirs to bear, not mine to shoulder. Sometimes, during a quiet evening in my studio, I'll reflect on the basement corner, the overshadowed childhood. The pain hasn't vanished, but it's transformed into a certain resilience that infuses my art. If they had treated me fairly, would I have discovered this fierce independence? Possibly not. Now when I see them, they walk on eggshells, trying their best to show genuine interest in my creations. My mother asks about upcoming exhibitions, my father inquires about commissions. Their support feels tardy, yet I appreciate the effort. Each time they leave my apartment, I see the wistfulness in their eyes, the unspoken yearning that maybe I'll come home. But this city, this life, it is my home. And they regret how their favoritism built an unbreachable distance. That I've learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean forgetting or reconciling fully. Sometimes it means acknowledging what happened, setting boundaries and moving on with your own life. My parents can regret their actions every day, but that regret belongs to them. I stand in my bright little studio, painting my truths onto canvas, forging ahead with a confidence they never nurtured but ultimately forced me to find. In that sense, I've made peace with the past. I am no longer the family's afterthought. I am simply me, a person who discovered her worth under the weight of being overlooked. And now, from afar, my parents wish they had seen me sooner.